Us today. It is so nice to have Sheridan alumni, students, faculty, and staff, and members of the community with us for our PD event, Minding the Mind, Neuroplasticity, Productivity, and Flow. My name is Alicia Seguire, and I'm the Alumni Corner Special Projects here at Sheridan. We are so excited to have Aiden Miller with us today from Sheridan Center for People and Organizational Development, or better known as CPOD in the Sheridan world. Aiden has been with CPOD since March of 2017. In her current role as Learning and Organizational Development Specialist, Aiden aids in the design, implementation, and facilitated delivery of various learning and development programs for frontline employees and leaders at Sheridan, while also assisting in various corporate and team level change initiatives across the organization. Before coming to Sheridan, she worked for Psychometrics in Edmonton, Alberta, as a talent development and performance consultant, where she specialized in using a variety of psychometric assessments toward the understanding and enhancement of human potential in the workplace. In her experience, her experience included the development and delivery of large-scale training initiatives for dozens of organizations across Canada, focusing on the areas of leadership development for executives and management, conflict resolution, team building, communication, change implementation, strategic planning, and more. So we encourage you to use the chat function throughout the presentation located on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to ask any questions anytime during the presentation. With all that being said, I think it's now time to turn it over to Aiden. Please join me in welcoming Aiden Miller. Welcome, Aiden.
Thanks so much, my friend Alicia. It's so good to be back with my alumni group. I have a very special place in my heart, obviously, for this group. And thank you all in the community for joining today. Great numbers. I really extend immense gratitude. The theme of today really is paying attention to what we're paying attention to. So thank you all for joining for an hour of your precious time, using your precious cognitive energy and effort to engage with this topic today. It's going to be a short hour, hopefully an enriching hour. I will say right away that this topic of neuroplasticity, productivity, and flow as it relates to this kind of neuroplasticity topic is immense. So I'm hoping also to plant a few seeds of different resources, different tips and tactics that you can look more into after the hour today. But as we kind of traverse this topic together, as Alicia said, I do really encourage you to use the chat. I see everyone saying hello and good afternoon, so it's great to see all of you. Use the chat, share your thoughts, share your questions. I'm going to be asking a few of my own. I find that it's so much better for learning as we all engage with it. So please use that. Feel free to ask questions as well. My friend Alicia, she's going to be kind of taking a little bit of an audit of the questions that come up. And I'm also going to be responding to the few that I see in real time, hopefully. So welcome, welcome. It's great to see you all. So as we get started, let's get that prefrontal cortex engaged, which is going to be very important throughout this presentation. Let's get that prefrontal cortex of our brains engaged. I'm going to ask you a couple questions to consider this afternoon. Okay, so to get started, the first thing I'd love you to consider and maybe put in the chat is, do you consider yourself good at multitasking? Concept of multitasking, what do we think? Yes, no, maybe some reasons why. Negative. Okay, so Victoria, thank you for weighing in. Not so good at multitasking. Anybody else? Sometimes, maybe it depends. Okay, Susan, thank you. Valerie, no. Good self-awareness, not so good at it. No. Great. Okay, so something to hold on to, something to consider. If you answered no or it depends, there's a very good neuroscientific reason why that might be. And we'll talk a little bit about that throughout this hour. Okay. The second one would be on any given work day, right? Imagine you get up, you're ready to start your work. What's the first thing you do in the morning? Right? Any given work day, what are some things you start off by doing? Jill, so we have an email reader. We check our email. We want to know what we've missed as we've been asleep. Okay, check emails. Okay, we've got Sherry. We do some stretching. Fabulous. Coffee, Margaret, I'm with you. Third one of the day, I will admit. Okay, great. So hold on to those things because what we know is what we do first with the prefrontal cortex attention and focus that we have can determine how tired or how energized we are for the rest of the day. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then finally, last but certainly not least, this notion of flow. What does flow mean to you? Is it a new concept? How would you define it? Any initial thoughts? Concept of flow. Who's familiar with it? Is it new? Oh, Smee, I love that prayer. Okay, love it. Getting in my zone, work zone, in the zone. Okay, so there's such a cool reason why we kind of qualify that experience with being in the zone, and it comes with certain key characteristics. So we want to explore that a little bit too during this hour, understand what it means for the synapses firing in our mind, and when we can't totally control the kind of work that brings that experience, what can we do in terms of brain and energy management that might make that experience a little bit more probable? Okay, so hopefully you're excited. Put in the chat if you want to know more. Put in your chat if I whet your appetite a little bit around the topics we're going to kind of unpack today, knowing that it is simply the tip of the iceberg when it comes to some of these topics. Okay, so the challenge. So let me know if you agree with this statement as well. Okay, the challenge, according to David Rock in his Brain, Your Brain at Work, is the following. And I would say that this is even more salient in a pandemic and a post-pandemic world, isn't it? Okay. So David Rock argues that workers everywhere are suffering overwhelm. For many, every day involves a constant, massive, and overwhelming volume of work. As the world digitizes, globalizes, unplugs, and reorganizes, having too much to do has indeed become our biggest complaint. Yes or no? Right? Do we agree? Do we feel as though we're constantly competing with various priorities that are increasingly complex, increasingly demanding? When we were working from home, it was a brand new experience. We were not only dealing with demanding task and work elements, but we were dealing with home, and our attention was split that way with children and homeschooling, right? We are living in an ever increasingly complex and demanding world. Even in Sheridan's strategic plan, we talk about this notion of a VUCA world, right? Volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. So as that increases and as the uncertainty goes up, we're having to deal with much more complex and demanding to-do lists, aren't we? And at the same time, the unfortunate and kind of inconvenient truth of it all is ancestrally, we still have the same brains we did 200 years ago when life was simple or simpler. So what do we do with this, right? Well, we know that time management, structuring our calendar is helpful, but David Rock argues it is no longer sufficient. What David Rock argues in the case for is this idea that in order to deal with an ever-increasing complex and demanding to-do list, we actually have to change the way our brain is processing those requests. We have to change the way that our mind operates and wires and functions in an ever increasingly complex world. Well, that sounds like quite a tall task. And the only thing that gives us hope and the only thing that we can rely on to say we actually do have the capacity to change our minds and change our brains for the better is this idea of self-directed neuroplasticity. Now, if that's a new term for all of you, that's okay. It was very new to me up until very recently. This notion of self-directed neuroplasticity was introduced by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz in his book, The Mind and the Brain in 2003. And he extensively researched the idea that the more we think about thinking, in other words, the more attention we pay to deciding what we pay attention to, we actually are in the driver's seat of how our brain functions. In other words, for the first time, he really sold the case and did an immense amount of research around the fact that we're not simply at the mercy of our predispositions in terms of how our brain wires and fires. In fact, we have a lot more control and a lot more decision-making power if we choose to use it. And he argues the case for choosing how and where and when to focus your attention. Attention being the primary resource that we need to operate in this new world, but the primary resource that we often lose and sacrifice and waste if we're not being mindful around it. Okay? So this is the notion of self-directed neuroplasticity, is thinking about how you think, thinking about the brain structures you have and how you're using them during any moment of the given day actually changes the way you think, and for the better. We make our brains more efficient, we make them more effective, and we have a better chance of optimizing those brain structures that are in charge of our most important executive functions. Kind of exciting, right? We have some control in how our brain works. The thing is, are we taking advantage of it? Are we looking more at brain management rather than time management, especially as the demand increases? Okay. Makes sense so far? Put in the chat if you're excited. Okay, put in the chat if you agree. Any questions that are coming up? The key to the topic today, and I'll introduce you to the director. I call this the director, or the gateway. Okay, the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, really is the secret sauce when it comes to your attention, your focus, your energy, and your productivity. No big deal, but the prefrontal cortex has been called by Amy Arnston, who teaches neurobiology at Yale. She said it is quite literally the biological hotbed of all your conscious interactions with the world. In fact, the prefrontal cortex is the only brain structure that keeps us from simply being on autopilot all the time. It holds all the contents of your mind in conjunction with all the moments of your current experience, all at the same time. It's pretty fabulous. Okay, look at all the things that it's in charge of. It's in charge of focus. It's in charge of inhibition. That is, by the way, not doing something you want to. It's in charge of how you regulate your emotions. So if you were part of the first talk we did back in October, we talked a lot about the amygdala. We talked a lot about this idea that our emotional center, or the amygdala, has a lot of power over what we do and how we think. It's actually the prefrontal cortex that keeps that in line. Okay? The prefrontal cortex is also hugely responsible for the decisions we make, or how we make decisions, how we make values judgments about what's important, how we solve problems, and also how we remember things. It's responsible for committing memories to short and long term, and it's responsible for understanding, evaluating, making sense of the world. That's a huge order for a brain structure. It's what we need to keep us conscious human beings. And ancestrally, it's also the newest part of our brain. So we're still kind of getting to know it, and we're still kind of integrating our understanding with all the things that we can allow it to do for us if we draw more attention to it. Okay, now here's something also to note about the prefrontal cortex. And maybe another unfortunate point about it is, first and foremost, it's tiny. Okay, the prefrontal cortex only composes about 4 to 5% of our entire brain volume. So something that's so important because of how our brains have ancestrally developed is quite small. Okay, which also means that it's limited. It also means that its resources are finite, and it gets tired quite quickly. And I'm sure we've all experienced that, haven't we? So when you think about that, when we think about all the important functions the prefrontal cortex is responsible for, and then we start to realize that if we're not using it selectively and strategically, we actually will waste the number one resource we have, and that's the energy that our prefrontal cortex has at its disposal. Okay, so it's small, it tires out quickly, and it's also quite picky. So it demands almost perfect conditions to fire optimally. Now, when we know this, when we know not only its capabilities, but we know its limitations, and remember neuroplasticity, we could start thinking about, how am I using my prefrontal cortex? How do I engage with it? How do I nurture it? And how do I actually kind of create structure or timing around when I think I will be most optimally engaged? It's being more strategic with your intention and attention. Okay. So here's the skill number one. If you were in our last chat, I kind of present 3 or 4 basic skills that I feel are still kind of high level, but nicely capture what we know in the research already around this idea of the prefrontal cortex and everything it needs to be as optimal as it can. So the first skill, and going back to the first question I asked you around multitasking, okay, here's the thing. The prefrontal cortex can only do one of these things at once. You cannot remember and emotionally regulate at exactly the same time. You have to pick one. Okay? You can't make a decision and recall something at exactly the same time. The prefrontal cortex doesn't work that way. So that has major implications for this idea of multitasking. The idea being that you can't do two conscious tasks at once without limiting the performance of one. So all of those folks who said, I'm not good at multitasking, that's actually really good self-awareness. And the truth of the matter is, arguably, no one is. The problem is we're often forced to do it. So if we're forced to do it, I have some tips and tactics. But when possible, avoid doing two conscious things at once, especially if they both have equal stakes in the output or outcome that you're striving for. Okay, so make sure that you're using focus. Make sure you're shining your flashlight on the most important task in that moment. Is it to solve that particular strategic problem? Is it to recall and remember and make a decision with those facts? You have to be able to focus your intention and attention on one at a time. Okay, so focus on one before moving on to the next. Did you know that even holding things in peripheral attention counts as multitasking? Another inconvenient truth. So even having your phone on and emails constantly coming in, that actually counts as a multitasking experience. They did a study, University of London, and it was a gender study. So about 20 years ago, they took individuals identifying as male and female, and they gave them an IQ test. Now, there are inherent problems with the IQ test, I'll give you that. But it was fascinating because all they did was they sat these individuals down, they had them do an IQ test, and all they did was send them texts at random intervals during that test. They didn't necessarily have to even do anything with the text besides read it. But the partial attention they needed to pay attention to that phone actually diminished their IQ points by a substantial amount. Women by 5, men by 15. And for all my fellows out there particularly interested in that tidbit, that's about 3 times the effect of cannabis. So when I say that we can't effectively multitask, it literally oftentimes equates to the performance you would have when you have an inducing type drug in your system. So something to keep in mind. So are there times where you can shut the phone off? Are there times when you should shut down your email to honor a particular task that is of utmost importance? Something to consider, okay? And all that to say, something to keep in mind too, especially in light of certain current events this week, going back to our prefrontal cortex, which of these functions, if you care to put it in the chat, focus, inhibition, emotional regulation, making decisions, remembering, and understanding, which of these do you think requires the most prefrontal cortex energy? Do you think it's recalling? Do you think it's remembering? Feel free to put in the chat, which do you think is the most exhausting thing to do? Any guesses? What really tires our PFC out? Yes. So I think that's my friend Alicia Sheridan, alumni. It's inhibition and emotional regulation, which is why don't be surprised if you have spent too much of your morning or too much of your day or too much of your week or too much of your year trying to continuously multitask or having to feel constantly on by the constant pinging of emails. Don't be surprised that the first thing to go is often our ability to regulate our emotions and inhibit automatic responses. I'm not going to bring up the Oscars except to say I'd be surprised if his PFC was operating at full capacity that night. Okay, so something to keep in mind. Another reason why we should be sparing or strategic with our attention, because our interpersonal relationships hinge on our ability to stay attentional and intentional. Okay. Another argument to be made for the same thing, this was recently on a Brene Brown podcast. If any of you are fans, I am one. She was interviewing a lady named Dr. Amishi Jha, who wrote Peak Mind. If you're interested in that book, great book. And they were arguing for this idea that our attention is like a flashlight. Multitasking or task switching really is not possible because we only have one light to shine. The more we try to shine that thing on multiple things at any given moment, The more our performance is limited, our mood is limited, and more errors are likely to occur. Another individual named David Crenshaw, if you're interested, wrote a book called The Myth of Multitasking, where he really digs into this research further. Okay. So, what if we have to? Aiden, we live in a world where the demands are constant. How am I supposed to tell my boss I have to turn off my phone for 2 hours? Sometimes it's simply not possible. Okay, I'm with you. There's the theory, and then there's the tactical and the reality of it. So here's what we suggest according to the research. Number one, if you have to multitask or if you have to do multiple things at once, the first recommendation is to pair a conscious task that is one that is responsible for the PFC, so focusing, remembering, inhibiting, pair one of those with something that has already become automatic for you, driving, showering, singing, right? Because what it's doing is using two different parts of the brain. One is using the prefrontal cortex, one is using the basal ganglia or the habit center. This is why some people get their best ideas when they're driving. Although attention is required, it's required from two different brain structures. Okay, that's the first thing. That is also a part of the reason why people often ask, why do I have to turn down the music when I'm in a new place? Because all of a sudden you're having to use the prefrontal cortex to focus because it's unfamiliar territory, and the music is actually taking away. It's acting as an interfering task. So it's pretty fabulous when you can relate it to your real life. Okay. The second piece is creating structure around focused attention. So if you know that you have a very busy day of competing tasks, okay, you know you have a busy day of really having to spread your attention around, try to at least structure your time where you can create focus in the daytime somehow. So predetermined times where you can turn your phone off, predetermined times where, to your point, Victoria, you're talking about listening to audiobooks or taking a break, right? Doing certain things at the same time that still nurture your mind and keep you learning while doing other things that are a little bit more passive. Can you work that into your day so that it doesn't feel like you're necessarily losing productivity, but you are remaining selective about where your attention is, what you're working on and when, and how that's being best honored? Okay. So for those folks who check their email first thing, I know that it feels like the most urgent thing to do, but did you know that checking your email first thing actually limits the amount of PFC energy that is left over for much headier tasks? So sometimes the first and best thing you can do is decide in the morning when you want to check your email and when you have enough energy to do that, perhaps after a more complex task. Is that making sense so far? Put in the chat if I'm resonating, if it's making some sense. It's all about kind of declaring sovereignty over how much you allow your emails, your pings, your social media to actually be energy draining when it comes to your attention and your focus. Okay. So that brings me, nice segue, to kind of my second recommendation about minding your mind. Prioritize prioritizing. And I don't mean simply just your calendar and how you're spending your time, but prioritizing around your mental energy and focus, specifically that PFC functioning, right? So prioritizing ensures that you're mindful about where you're spending your attention. So what time of day do you know that you're optimal? If you feel really good in the morning, maybe tackle some of those more demanding tasks first thing. Get to the emails later when it is less demanding on some of the more higher level executive functioning. Or maybe which meetings and activities will be the most demanding. In other words, which meetings am I going to that might demand more inhibition or emotional regulation? I better make sure I have the energy to do that. I better make sure I don't spend so much time multitasking before that meeting that I'm spent, that I can't engage in the way that I want. Right? When should I switch my phone off? So going back to that previous skill recommendation. Okay. So again, do note that prioritizing does take energy in and of itself. It's an activity that demands remembering, decision making, recall, understanding, all at the same time. So prioritizing in and of itself is a pretty heady task. That's why the recommendation is to do that first. Okay, break up tasks, get them out of your head and onto paper. That's less noise for the prefrontal cortex, creates a little bit more clarity, creates a little bit more of a direction external to the mind, which also frees up energetic space. and break complex ideas down into core elements when necessary. Okay? So just some tips and tactics. Prioritizing, and not just do this email first, but let me actually look at my day and figure out when might be the most demanding and when am I going to be at my best and what should I tackle during those times. Okay, great. Third, which may seem contrite, which is something I think we may all know, but not necessarily something that we've articulated in its relation to the prefrontal cortex before. And part of neuroplasticity is actually nourishing our brain. Okay, so the third skill I have for you during this hour is simply to remember to nurture your prefrontal cortex. Okay, first one being sugar. It's not necessarily that I'm endorsing an unhealthy diet. This picture simply means that glucose of any form is a neurotransmitter building block for your prefrontal cortex. So in order for your prefrontal cortex to release all that good chemical stuff that keeps its synapses firing optimally, it requires glucose to do so. So skipping meals will not lead to very good cortical attention selection. Okay. They actually also did a study on court judges who were responsible for accepting or denying parole of inmates. 3 out of 4 judges, if they were hungry, were more likely to deny parole because it was simply more work for the brain. So what we start to do is if we're hungry or we're not nourished, the prefrontal cortex defaults. We stop giving the benefit of the doubt and we stop being mindful decision makers because our brain is wonderful, but it's lazy when it's hungry and tired. So please nourish. And then of course the second one then being that sleep. As adults, I think we tend to take it for granted, and sometimes we can't help it. But as of now, we still need the same amount of sleep as we did 15, 20 years ago. But we see from the research that we still require 7 to 8 hours for that prefrontal cortex to work optimally. And adults are on average getting about 5.5 to 6.5 in this current climate. Something to keep in mind. Sleep not only acts as a car wash for some of those toxins that can build up and actually lead to Alzheimer's eventually, but it also acts as a mechanism for consolidation and learning. Did you know that sometimes your prefrontal cortex operates best when you're not around, when you're asleep? It consolidates memories, it recalls things that it needs to, it comes up with ideas. So keep that in mind, honor your sleep, and when you have that rest, make sure you're doing something in the morning that might be able to take advantage of all that consolidation that it's done in the evening. Also, I'm a big fan of naps. Sometimes I remember things better after a 20-minute cat nap. Okay. Oh, Teresa, I'm with you. Yes, sometimes if I'm doing something really exhausting, I let myself have a nap because I actually trust the process of it percolating deeper into my long-term memory if I do so. So absolutely something that I recommend. Okay. Presence. I don't know how many of you folks like to practice mindfulness. There is extensive research on the benefits of mindfulness, especially as it pertains to the prefrontal cortex. Okay. So this idea of paying attention, this idea of presence, this idea of staying in the moment. Did you know that so much of what exhausts our prefrontal cortex is simply us thinking about the past or obsessing about the future? That is draining for the prefrontal cortex because we're imagining and recalling and we're not even working on anything in front of us. So what mindfulness and presence does is it gives it a break. It focuses on the present moment. And when we focus on the present moment, we can make better decisions about what is worth our attention in that moment. And we save ourselves energy. Okay. And then finally, nature. I just put that picture there because for me, nothing is more inspiring of presence than getting out, getting away from my desk and embracing the world that we were always built to operate within. Okay. So giving yourself that break, having even plants around you, having nature around you has been shown to notably increase levels of happy chemicals in the nervous system. So dopamine, oxytocin, our PFC loves those particular chemicals. Okay. I see some great questions, so I am taking note of them as well. And Alicia, I'm going to throw it to you after because I think they're really, really great ones. Okay. Finally, in terms of the flow that I promised I would unpack with this group, okay, So minding your mind, skill number 3, I would say is all about finding and keeping your flow state. So I asked you what flow means to you initially. I saw some great definitions. So if I scroll up, I see this being in the zone, being so immersed in your work and being so engaged, Erin, that you do your best and totally forget about time. Absolutely. Wouldn't that be a fabulous place to exist in? And I think it's unrealistic potentially to think that we can operate there continuously. I do think there are moments of time where we are optimally psychologically engaged in our work. But if you want to know a little bit more about this concept, it was socialized and introduced by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi in 1990. And what it really means and the general characteristics he used to kind of describe this experience is number one, there's a goal, you're working towards something. And number 2, there's continuous feedback in any given moment about how you're doing and working toward that goal. So you kind of have an important mixture of challenge with progress. Okay. And when you combine all those things, people do report, Erin, to your point, they report that there is kind of this loss of time and reality. It's why you feel in the zone. You feel like you're in your flow because you're almost operating in such a mindful capacity that it feels mindless, but you feel masterful, engaged, and optimized. Okay. So I'm just curious for the group, put in your chat, have you experienced this? When do you experience this most? Is it values related, time related? I'm just curious about what the subjective experience of flow is with the folks that are joining us today. What brings about flow? What kind of tasks bring this kind of concept about, yeah, I feel totally lost in my work, values related? Amazing. Ken, anything you can add to that? Is it things that you really want to be doing? Things that are important to you? Most often when training Kung Fu. I love that, James. Thank you. So you're in the zone, you're immersed. It's challenging to teach other people, but you're also getting constant feedback about how that's landing. That's a wonderful example. I'm doing art or sewing, totally lost in the moment. Doris, you probably recognize that you can look up and 2 hours baby has gone by, right? When I love the work. Okay. So this is just an introspection question because I do think that flow is a really important thing to try to capture, try to optimize. And because it is so subjective, this is just something to consider is when do you find that and when can you protect it? Because we know that in order to even find flow, you have to have a certain level of PFC energy available to you in that moment, or else we're either too tired or too overwhelmed. Okay? And what I'm seeing here, some of these ideas that are coming up are great examples of this notion of things you can do for recovery. Okay? Because flow also helps recover the PFC. You're operating in such a way that you're completely mindful and you're not necessarily overthinking any one action. The prefrontal cortex loves that. So some of these ideas I'm seeing, the sewing, the teaching, 11th hour, I love some of this pressure promptedness I'm seeing, which is going to come in really handy for our kind of next discussion here. But knowing that, knowing when you find it and how you get it is going to be really important for recovery time. So taking a moment out of your day and engaging with those kinds of activities. Okay. If those kinds of activities arise for you in the work that you do anyway, perfect. You'll probably find that you're a lot more engaged throughout the day if you have a few of those moments interspersed. The question is it happening naturally for you, or should you be more planful and mindful about injecting flow into your day and into your life? Okay. Makes sense so far? Flow is very closely related as well to the Yerkes-Dodson phenomenon. So Dr. Robert Yerkes, Dr. John Dodson, if you've seen the Big Bang Theory on this idea of optimal anxiety, which is very funny, by the way, this might also look familiar to you. But the argument is that there is this notion of a sweet spot of stress. So there's a curvilinear relationship between stress, or what we call eustress, or arousal, and performance. Okay. Now the challenge is this is a pretty tricky balance. The idea being that if you aren't engaged enough, right? If you're kind of on the left-hand side of that curve, you experience boredom, apathy, disinterest. You're not really paying attention because, quite frankly, it's just not engaging to you. The challenge is if you're too stressed, if you kind of pass that sweet spot and you get overwhelmed, that's actually when your limbic brain or your emotional brain takes over and you blank out, you can't remember things. You're starting to operate from what they call is the brain stem. Okay, so your performance actually drops off at that point. So there's this sweet spot. And if you actually look at the chemicals in the prefrontal cortex when this is occurring, and you can otherwise kind of see this as akin to the flow experience, what's actually happening is a perfect balance of two chemicals called dopamine and norepinephrine. And I hate to demystify flow, I hate to demystify when we're at our best, but truly it is a matter of a perfect harmony of two neurochemicals. Okay? So this means a couple things. Number one, you can do yourself an immense favor by knowing where that sweet spot is for you in terms of the projects that you're working on, or even in terms of the time of day you're more likely to experience it, right? I know for me, in even preparing for this presentation, I can plan it, I can work on it, but I'm not the best at truly prepping for it until the last minute. I've always been that way. But me knowing that about myself, I've been able to work my timing and my calendar out such that I can prep in the best way possible for me to recall it when it counts by making sure my day was blocked yesterday. Because I know that I'm a pressure prompted individual. So if you're an early starter, that's great. It just means that your sweet spot is earlier on. Perhaps you're a planner. You like to get going right away and you recognize that your sweet spot of optimal engagement or the chances that you will reach flow happen far earlier in the project plan. Are you planning for that? Are you mindful of that? And are you taking permission or giving yourself permission to then organize and structure your calendar and your workday around really capitalizing on that experience? Because that is when your brain and your PFC is at its best. Okay. The other piece is if it's dopamine and norepinephrine related, there are things we can do to simulate those chemicals in that experience. Okay. So the first tactic around this idea of flow or this Yerkes Dodson phenomenon, if I had to boil it down in a quick 10-minute kind of overview, number one, plan for your peak. Now that you know it exists, or now that you know what kind of activities bring you flow, schedule execution according to when your brain works best. And that might be a very individual thing for you. Okay. So where and when possible, of course, in the midst of a demanding day, when and where should you build in recovery? Where and when should you organize meetings or a certain execution of tasks around when you like to start and when you like to finish and when your brain's going to operate the best? Okay. And then perhaps, again, going back to that notion of checking emails first thing, I get the temptation, but sometimes even after checking a few emails, we do not have enough of these chemicals to induce flow for potentially the rest of the day. So my only advice is sometimes those emails are urgent, sometimes they are important, but more often they're urgent, not important. So how intentional are we being around when we get to them and how? Okay. Because saving your energy is really important, perhaps for things that require more executive demand. Okay, so plan for your peak. What else can we do if we don't necessarily have that much sovereignty over our calendar, if we have a very front-facing job where we feel like we're constantly reacting to demands? I also have a few tips and tactics for that as well. So remember how if we're not aroused or stimulated enough, we're bored? Too much so, it can lead to overwhelm, stress, and anxiety. Well, in order to increase arousal, let's say you're bored, okay? Let's say you've already had 3 cups of coffee and you can't do it chemically from the outside in, you can do it from the inside out. So sometimes imagining the stakes, imagining what might happen if something goes wrong, I wouldn't do that too much, it can lead to poor rumination, but sometimes that's just enough to get that arousal up, okay? Bringing newness or novelty. So sometimes even taking a different route to work, right? Leave early enough so that getting lost doesn't give you too much stress. But sometimes taking a new route, introducing novelty, doing your work in a different room, doing your work in a different environment, Right? Sometimes going to someone else's house might bring enough of that dopamine to increase arousal and bring optimization of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, make a joke. By the way, joking and humor. If you came to my first talk, sometimes I asked what were some of the characteristics of the best leader you've ever worked with and for, and humor came up. And it's no surprise that humor has such a great influence over the chemicals being released in our prefrontal cortex. It releases dopamine and adrenaline at the same time. So, when appropriate, have a laugh. When with trusted others, make a joke. Okay? And then if you find yourself on the other side of that curve, if you feel that you're getting emotional, if you feel as though that norepinephrine is coming up a little bit too much, it's starting to block your happiness receptors, starting to block your ability to recall and remember, it's okay. Don't panic. Some things you can keep in mind is reduce what's in the mind. So writing things down, this notion of journaling, that's why it's been shown to be so effective. It activates a portion of the prefrontal cortex called the reticular activating system, which actually takes power away from some of that ruminative thought and tendency. Okay? Getting it out of the mind, getting it on paper creates space in the mind quite literally. Okay? Activate other areas of the brain. So I saw some of these ideas come up in the chat. Listen to something, listen to a podcast, get some music on. I love guided meditation because what it actually does is it uses a different part of the brain. It gives your prefrontal cortex a rest, and it also reminds it that you're not actually in danger. Our brain likes to operate like we are in fight or flight, even when that's not necessary. So, to bring that response down and to bring back dopamine rather than more adrenaline, listen to something, get out of that zone, and of course, bring in moments of flow and activity for recovery. Okay. Taking a breath, again, it sounds contrite. Sometimes I like to describe my job as organized common sense because you've probably heard these before. Taking a breath is not simply just giving your prefrontal cortex a moment in terms of time, which is still important, right? It's helpful. But there is a chemical reason why this is so necessary, and it's because oxygen metabolizes adrenaline and cortisol, which is the stress hormone, quicker than any other substance on Earth. So that's pretty cool when we really think about oxygen and air being able to eat up the chemicals that are stressing us out. It's really important to take that moment, take that breath. Okay? And then mindfulness, just a reminder, staying present, staying engaged, reminding your body and your limbic brain that you're not in trouble also gives your prefrontal cortex a chance to rest because it's not constantly trying to emotionally regulate a hijacked emotional center. So stay in the moment, recognize where you are, take audit, pay attention, and use meditation if it works for you. Okay. Tips and tactics from the research. So, because I wanted to reserve some time for great questions, we have about 15 minutes, but I will put these books out to you. These are the ones that I've mentioned in today's talk. Your Brain at Work, of course, being the one that I started with when preparing this presentation. That one by David Rock really changed the way that I approached my workday, approached the way that I thought about myself and those around me and my leaders in terms of really using the perspective of energy management rather than time management. Okay. The Myth of Multitasking, David Crenshaw, Mind in the Brain, and Peak Mind are all sources that went into the presentation you saw today. So thanks, folks. So Alicia, I guess I'll open it up for a few minutes of questions and commentary.
Sure. So, if anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. So there was a question around sleep and the importance of sleep. So when you said we need 7 to 8 hours, is it continuous or can it be broken up into parts, like topped up with a nap?
Yeah, so here's, technically speaking, the recommendation is 7 or 8 continuous hours of quality sleep. Now, here's what I'll also offer, which is a great question. If you can't get that, there is merit to then getting a rest and making sure that that quality sleep is revisited at some point in your day, just to make sure you're getting some added benefit of that shut eye. Yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, we're supposed to be getting 7 to 8 still.
Huh. Can you tell my kids that, please?
See, and we give our kids bedtimes,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, when we grow up, we subjugate that for ourselves. And the question is, why? We still need it as much, if not more.
So going back keeping on the track of sleep, so what is the ideal nap time?
Oh, goodness, that's a great question. So, I'm sure that if you look into sleep studies, there is probably a best practice recommendation. I'm not necessarily sure what that is. I think it was Stephanie. What
Hmm.
I would say from this, right, from all of this kind of research we know about self directed neuroplasticity, I would say it depends on you. I would say there are probably certain times of the day where you find it harder to bounce back from a nap, or maybe it's too long that you're not capable of kind of rechanneling your PFC in an optimal way. So I would say experiment. Perhaps it's late morning so that you still have the full afternoon and you feel rested and recovered rather than you feel like giving up on your day. But it may be mid afternoon just to get through the doldrums. So I would say that's probably a pretty subjective experience, but try it out and watch what your PFC does. Talk about think about thinking. Yeah.
And what about length?
Yeah, length. There's a lot of discussion around length. Some people say 20 minutes is ideal just for clearing out those toxins and re-engaging. Some people say that I often need at least an hour, depending on the length of time that I've had at night. Right. So again, pretty subjective. But the recommendations are between 20 and 45 minutes if you've had your quality night's sleep, from what I've read.
And then this another question about that slide where sleep, food, sugar. Any thoughts on intermittent fasting?
Intermittent fasting. Okay, so I will not pretend that I'm a diet guru or a master in that subject. So I would not want to necessarily put any recommendations out there one way or another. Again, based on this being kind of watching your mind and minding your mind, I think it works for many people for lots of reasons in terms of what their chemicals are responding to and with. But it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So, those who wake up with a great deficiency of glucose, who can't necessarily engage optimally unless and until something is in their system, it would take a lot for me to encourage them to do intermittent fasting, knowing what we know about brain science. So, again, something to play around with. When do you feel you're optimal? When do you feel you're most energetic and engaged? Is it when you engage in some fasting? Is it when you have some food in your belly to get going?
Going back up here. So Shannon is asking, what about someone who has ADHD? Are all these suggestions practices still applicable, or are there other pieces one would need to consider?
I always think there's always other elements and layers of complexity. I love that question, right? I think anytime you're kind of looking at these suggestions and best practice, I think a lot of them still hold true, but I also want to make sure that we're internalizing and embodying our subjective and lived experience. So these may not work as well for everyone, given kind of our lived experience that we're coming to the table with. But I would really encourage, right, whether focus is easier or not as easy for you, I still think being intentional around the energy that you're investing and with which tasks can be a really good piece of mindfulness for everyone. And I would also encourage, are there any tasks and activities that tend to quiet the mind if you struggle with ADHD? What are those? And do those give you a sense of flow and recovery back into your day? So it's really maybe playing around with how much, when, and also having very realistic expectations for yourself and always practicing self compassion as well.
And then in the comments here, you can see Alyssa and Marcy have given some great additional resources.
Fabulous.
Yes, so Alyssa says another great book is Confidence is a Choice. Was endorsed by many neuro experts at Harvard and others. And Marcy says is When by Daniel Pink. So it's the best time to
Thank
take
you.
naps, exercise based on all of our different rhythms.
I love it. So yeah, if you want some of the best practice, when to nap, when to work out, I'll be looking into that book. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Alyssa. Fabulous.
Sorry about that. Any other questions? I mean, I had a question when you were talking about our emails and our Teams messages and all that coming up. So I was kind of curious. I was like, I wonder what Aiden does. So because I
That's a
know when
good
I
question.
try to focus on work, then I'll get a Teams message, and then I'll get a notification that an email has come in and stuff. So do you turn your Teams off when you're trying to work, or on do not disturb, which people still don't
True. Yeah. There are certain team norms as well. So if you start to change your behaviors, sometimes be prepared to explain why you're doing what you're doing to your team, right? Because sometimes those are the expectations we've created. So I think that's a really great question, Alicia. For me, there are times where I do turn my email and my teams off if I'm dealing with a particularly complex conversation, a task and a project that I know is going to take multiple kinds of PFC functioning at once. There are times where I give myself permission. There's also times where if I'm dealing with perhaps a task that requires a little bit less focus, that I feel okay about leaving that background stuff on, I do, but I also remain mindful that I don't necessarily have to answer each and every single one right away. Okay. And that's another kind of team endorsed value and behavior that we might even be encouraged to talk about our team with is what are our actual reasonable expectations about getting back to each other right away? If it's a simple few word response, no problem, I'll re engage. But if I then have to follow something or do something or open something, the chances that I'm going to go back to my original task with as much energy and fervor is very much negated and brought down. So, staying mindful, even when you have those things running in the background, is a really great skill to have.
And do you block everything in your calendar?
I'm a big fan of blocking. That I'm not going to say that's a popular opinion. It might be a provocative one, but I do give myself that permission to block when I know that I'm coming up against a PFC demanding task or I've got a week that I really need to be very reserved about the attention and focus that I'm spending on everything. I do block, and I think we almost have to in this day and age.
Mm-hmm. And then one last question from Stephanie. She just wants to clarify the reason for not checking emails in the morning is to avoid wasting your PFC energy.
Yeah. So it's you know what? If you decide that answering a few of those emails is when you exactly should do it because they're a little bit complex and they require some thoughtful responses, that's okay. But to check and answer every email that you've gotten over the last 12 hours sometimes isn't the best use of that valuable executive functioning. Great question. Hope that
Right.
makes sense for you.
Awesome. So, well, thank you so much, Aiden. As always, it's an absolute pleasure having you with us here today.
Thank you.
I think everyone on the call with us can say that can definitely have numerous strategies to help improve our productivity. So, thank you so much for that. Thank you to everyone who attended today. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Please make sure to check out our website for more exciting events coming up next month. And I'm sure we'll be doing more with Aiden probably in the fall and in the winter, spring again next year. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Bye for now.
Have a great day, folks.
We just need to wait that 10 seconds.